Good morning and welcome. My name is Oreen Chowdhury and I'm the chair of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. At this time, I'm going to call to order our regular meeting for Tuesday, April 29th, 2025. I want to offer a friendly reminder to all committee members, staff, and the public that these messages are broadcast live to enable greater public participation. These broadcasts include real-time captioning as a further method to increase the accessibility of our proceedings to the community. Therefore, all speakers need to be mindful of the rate of their speech so that our captioners can fully capture and transcribe all comments for the broadcast. We ask all speakers to moderate their speed and clarity of their comments. I'll now have the clerk call the roll.
Councilmember Payne.
Present.
Wansley is absent. Vita.
Present.
Ellison is absent. Osman is absent. Cashman.
Present.
Jenkins is absent. Chavez.
Present.
Chugtai.
Present.
Koski is absent. Palmisano.
Present.
Vice Chair Rainville.
Present.
Chair Chowdhury.
Present.
There are 8 members present.
Let the record reflect that we have a quorum. I'll also remind my colleagues that we are using speaker management today, so make sure you sign in. And we just have one item on our agenda today, which is an update on federal and state actions affecting the city. I'll now invite up Director Katie Topinka to present on this item.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Chowdhury and council members. We are happy to be here today to provide an update on state and federal actions. We will start with an update on the state legislative session and then pause there to see if there are questions and then transition to a federal update. So this is our last scheduled update for you all before the end of the regular legislative session, which ends on May 19th. I'm not going to go through these in depth again, but as a reminder, these are the priorities that the IGR team has been talking to legislators about throughout session, and we'll touch on these things as we go through an update about where things stand today. So as I just mentioned, the regular session ends on May 19th. At this point, most of the omnibus budget bills in the respective House and Senate committees have been passed out of committee and moved into Ways and Means and Finance, and some have passed off the floor at this point. So the next step for those are for conference committees to begin so that the House and Senate can work out differences between their budget bills. So this just is an overview of what that conference committee process looks like. So each body has their own versions of policy or finance bills based on different topic areas. If the content of the bills is not the same, which for all of the budget bills it is not the same, then the body has to appoint a conference committee with members from each party. Because the House is tied, there will be an even split of Democrats and Republicans on the House side for each conference committee. On the Senate side, they will have a DFL majority. During the conference committee process, they work out differences between the bills and come to a consensus. And then they release what's called a conference committee report. And once that's passed out of conference committee and sent back to the floor, it cannot be amended. So then they just vote yes or no on the floor for a final vote on those budget bills. If they don't pass off the floor, then they have to go back to conference committee. So now I'm just going to cover some of the highlights from the different budget bills that have made their way through the process. Although I'm starting with 2 topics that have not made their way through the process yet, which are taxes and capital investment. These bills are always released last. They don't have to meet the finance deadlines that the other finance committees have to meet. And so we have not seen taxes or capital investment bills in the House or Senate yet. And again, this is not uncommon. But what we do know is what their targets are and some of the things they've been discussing. So in the House, the tax committee has a $40 million reduction as a target, which means they have to find $40 million in savings, either through cutting taxes or cutting expenditures in a tax bill. Tax bills do have to originate in the House, so the House will release its tax bill first. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but potentially this week, or if not this week, then likely next week. The Senate tax target is a $365 million reduction, which is obviously much larger than the House's reduction, but the Senate has had some discussions about increasing revenue, whereas the House GOP have very firmly said they're not open to increasing revenue, so we do not anticipate any revenue raisers in a House tax bill. The Senate has, well, both the House and Senate actually heard proposals for a new social media tax, which would tax social media companies that have more than 100,000 members or subscribers, whatever the word is you want to use, in Minnesota. It'd be a sales tax. The governor also proposed a sales tax expansion, so it was expanding the base but lowering the rate, but it would raise additional revenue. So those are some of the proposals on the table, and we'll see what comes out when tax bills are released. Just as a reminder, some of the things we've been talking about in the tax bills are the CUB credit, which is the catalyzing underutilized building credit. Given the targets, it may be tough for them to fund that this year, but we're hopeful it can maybe at least be in at least one body even if it's a scaled back amount than what the request was for. We are also had a hearing on a TIF proposal that would allow Minneapolis to create a special TIF district for converting underutilized buildings. And we've also been discussing the expansion of our downtown taxing boundary to include the North Loop. So we will, when the tax bills come out, we'll see where those things are and continue working on them from there. Capital investment, similarly, we don't have bills yet, but we do have targets. So the House had a pretty small capital investment target that would allow for a $700 million capital investment bill. That's not a very big bonding bill. There's far more than that in requests just from state agencies, and so it wouldn't allow for a ton of local projects. We have, of course, been talking with our delegation and with capital investment leaders about the city's priorities, which include the Nicollet Avenue Bridge, the water yard, and the 36-inch water main. And we do feel like if there's room in a bill, we're in a good position, but it's really going to come down to how big the bill is. And then, of course, as we've talked about, I think every time we talk about this, capital investment bills do require a supermajority, and so they have to be bipartisan, and so that just means it can be more difficult to come to agreement. The Senate does have room in its target for a larger capital investment bill, which would allow for more local projects. They have a target of $27 million in debt service, which would allow for a $1.35 billion bill. What we have been hearing is that there likely won't be a capital investment bill until there's joint targets, which, as part of the conference committee process, House and Senate leadership and the governor come together to come up with a global set of budget targets for the conference committees to work with. And so that's likely when we'll see a capital investment bill, which is still probably at least a week or more away from having joint targets. Moving on then to some other issue areas that the city follows closely. Workforce, labor, and economic development. This is one where the House bill actually has not been released yet. The leadership in the House is still working on it. The Senate released a jobs bill that included an $8 million increase. They made some adjustments to the Promise Act, which you may recall that was first passed in 2023, and it was for funding for recovery on Lake Street and in North Minneapolis, recovering from the unrest in 2020. It also helped areas of St. Paul and other parts of the state as well. So some of the adjustments are an increase in the loan amount that businesses would be eligible for to try to reach additional businesses. That money is implemented by NDC and MEDA and has helped a number of businesses in Minneapolis. There's also a number of direct appropriations to organizations that are located in Minneapolis. One of the things we had been advocating for was a base increase to the Minnesota Youth Program, which is a state workforce development program. The money goes to local workforce development boards, including Minneapolis, and then we use it to fund Step Up. That unfortunately was not included in the bill. They had a small target, and so they certainly couldn't include everything. So that's something we'll likely be continuing to advocate for going into conference and in the future, because we'd like to see an increase for that program because it's an important program for us. As I mentioned, the House bill is still being negotiated. There's a note on here about discussions on paid family medical leave. I'll cover that more in a later slide. Moving on to housing and homelessness, there has been a lot of talk this session, again, about missing middle and zoning reform. There were several bills that had hearings. There had been a goal to kind of create a mini bill just around missing middle and zoning reform that didn't move forward in quite that way. In the House, they ended up including a provision in the housing budget bill that would require the State Housing Finance Agency to give extra points in their scoring system to projects located in cities that have done sort of pro-density policies. We've reviewed that language and are comfortable that Minneapolis would already meet the standard that's written in that provision based on things we've done through 2040 and other policies. There is another hearing scheduled for this week on another zoning reform bill in the Senate State and Local Government Committee. It's a slightly scaled down version of some of the previous bills. It is focused on provisions around reducing minimum parking mandates, aesthetic mandates, so materials requirements and aesthetic requirements, and some administrative review processes, as well as some restrictions around homeowners associations. We will be sharing some feedback with authors this week. I think some of one example of something that we would potentially have some concerns about is restrictions on placement of windows. For missing middle housing, the city does require front-facing windows so that it's, really transit-oriented development. So that's one example. We've talked with legislators about this throughout session, and generally people seem open to that concept, that if we're developing housing as transit-oriented development, we could have some design standards around that. So we'll be continuing to work with the authors on that. I'm not sure if it has the votes to move forward or not, but we'll see this week. In the budget bills, there is some ongoing funding for rental assistance and the Family Homeless Prevention Assistance Program, which is helpful. On the human services side, which is where the Bridge to Shelter proposal was heard. This is the funding for shelters in Hennepin County as we're looking at the shelter fiscal cliff. That they had cut targets on the human services side, so they had to come up with reductions, and they were not able to fund the Bridge to Shelter proposal. There was $1 million included in new emergency shelter funding that's statewide, and there is some base funding for that program, but of course, we had been advocating for the Bridge to Shelter proposal, knowing that some of the new shelters in Hennepin County are facing this fiscal cliff. And so I think, we'll have to see what happens during conference committee, but there will need to be obviously some discussions with the county and providers about where to go from here on that.
Director Topinka. We just have one question, I think, on the last couple slides, so maybe we'll just take it here. But before that, I will recognize that Councilmember Wansley, Jenkins, and Ellison has joined the meeting. The question is from Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you. I'm really glad that we're, as a city, advocating for a Bridge to Shelter, and I know that there's some other stuff like the supplemental rate stuff, which is a little bit above my head technically, but I know it really matters to a lot of our shelter providers. So hopefully those things can move forward and prevail, but it sounds like Bridge to Shelter is in real danger of not prevailing and not happening. And I just wanted to, for my colleagues, I'm sure all my colleagues know, but also for the public, because we're on public broadcast, I mean, Hennepin County is facing a $16 million cliff at the end of this year. That's correct?
Councilmember Chowdhury and Councilmember Ellison, or Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Ellison. I think it may be 13 million, but okay. In that ballpark. Yes.
In the ballpark, in that range. And so that's $13 million worth of services that are going to need to be cut from the county in terms of addressing homelessness. And I don't know how others feel about that, but $13 million a year sounds like a lot of money. That sounds like a lot of services cut. And, kind of makes me wonder, if there are currently $13 million worth of services happening that are keeping people either partially housed or permanently housed or helping them transition to being housed, I mean, how many people is that essentially hitting the streets if we're just not able to get this funding? I'm sure you don't know the answer to that, but it's a question that sort of comes up for me when I think about this. And it feels like overall, I know we at the city and at the county are talking about Bridge to Shelter, but it just kind of feels like one of those conversations that in the community, I don't know that folks really understand the like level of severity we're sort of heading towards. And then another question that I had that maybe you do know the answer to, but like the Bridge to Shelter funding doesn't just affect Minneapolis and Hennepin County. It's not like our homeless population is going to explode alone. Do you know what the cliffs are for Ramsey County, how this might impact, St. Paul, or even just the 7-county metro?
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Ellison, so the proposal itself included about, I believe, $70 million statewide,
Right.
and then the portion for Hennepin County was that $13 million. I don't know if the providers in, let's say, Ramsey County have the exact same situation as the providers in Hennepin. But I do know, statewide, a lot of communities were able to scale up in terms of homelessness response services because of ARPA funding, and ARPA funding has gone away. And so that's why we're facing this issue in Hennepin County, and I'm assuming other communities, if it's not exactly the same, have some similar challenges due to ARPA funding no longer being an option.
Yeah. So I guess last thing I'll say, and this is not a question, it's just, for us to be thinking about up here. I mean, I think I don't know of, at least eminently, a more important issue that we could be facing as a body. We're in a position where, I get it, it's complicated. Everybody's trying to figure out how do we solve this issue. It does worry me when we have certain electeds posturing as if we sort of like solve this issue right at the time we're about to hit a $13 million cliff at the county. It's just really concerning to me, and it doesn't just impact us here in the city of Minneapolis. Like, these narratives are going to hurt Ramsey. These narratives are going to hurt St. Paul. These narratives are going to hurt our neighbors immediately around us. And so I'm really worried that especially given that there's not a lot of buzz around this conversation, that the funding won't prevail, because it's a good way to save taxpayers' money, only for us to turn around at the beginning of 2026 and people are experiencing this explosion of homelessness in their communities that they were not anticipating because nobody talked about it. And so I'm, I guess I'm just voicing that, and I hope that that's a place that we can get to with our partners at the county and at the legislature to view this as a priority.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Ellison. On Friday, we did have just a check-in with our IGR team. That was me and Vice Chair Rainville, and that's also kind of where we discussed a little bit more about the reality of Bridge to Shelter. And one of the things that we discussed doing is having an opportunity for our IGR team to work with us and leadership to get information with Hennepin County to understand what would occur if we don't get this funding from the state, and also like what strategies do we have left at the table to continue to advocate, because I believe the funding that we are currently seeing to get is about $1 million in emergency service provider funding, and that's like a drop in the bucket. So we'll keep you updated on that conversation, and I think, now is a really good time to kind of speak publicly and raise the alarm on this situation. And just wanted to echo that I share that urgency with you. And I know we have Heading Home Hennepin, I think tomorrow, and I think that'll be a topic of discussion as well. And I'll pass it back to you, Councilmember Ellison.
Yeah, thank you. Just one last thing. Look, it's better to have $1 million than to not have $1 million, but my understanding is that $1 million doesn't address that cliff at all, right? It just sort of kind of maintains some current levels, or doesn't address the $13 million cliff, is my understanding. And then the other thing I'll say is, like, the county has a list, and I know you know this, but I'm saying for the public, I mean, 24-hour shelters, gone. Avivo Villages, gone. There's like a list of like 12 programs serving at least 1,000 people right this moment that'll be gone and serve much more than that going forward. And so, like, you know, my question is, I know this is like kind of maybe oversimplifying it, but are we talking about 1,000 people hitting the streets in January? Or are we talking about 2,000? I mean, that's the way I think people need to be framing this question if the county actually hits this cliff without any kind of redress.
Next, I'll recognize President Payne.
Thank you, Chair Chowdhury. Yeah, I would just uplift what Councilmember Ellison is raising here and just say that in my time in office, there's just been such a hot potato game played across jurisdictions on this really complex topic of homelessness. And this is a real opportunity to have all of the right jurisdictions in alignment. And if this is going to fall apart at the state, we're going to be right back where we were. And I think yes, it's easy to say that it is the county's responsibility for homelessness, but the challenge happens in our streets, and we have to have a response to that. And so to put a finer point on what Councilmember Ellison's talking about is, are we going to have to raise property taxes to meet this gap? Because the need will be there, whether or not this legislation passes at the state. So just wanted to put that finer point on it.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I will pass it back to you, Director Topinka.
Thank you, Chair Chowdhury. And if I could just comment briefly on Councilmember Ellison's comment on the $1 million, that would be money that's available statewide. There is additional money in the base, and I'm trying to check on what that amount is, and because I don't know it off the top of my head, so if I get that while we're still meeting, I'll tell you. But that is money that providers can apply for statewide, so it could potentially address a piece of the fiscal cliff, but it would have to be done through a competitive application process. So just wanted to note that. All right, moving to the next slide around energy and environment. The Senate bill does include a policy provision that would remove the preemption in state statute from local governments having plastic bag bans. So this was put into statute several years ago, mostly presumably in response to the city of Minneapolis's plastic bag ban that we then adjusted to be a plastic bag fee. This would remove that provision and would allow local governments to have a plastic bag ban again if they chose to do so. That is in the Senate bill. It's not in the House bill, so that will have to be sorted out in conference. The Senate bill also includes $2 million for geothermal planning grants, and then both the House and Senate bill have so the governor had proposed a fee increase for well management fees. This is a program that's managed by the Minnesota Department of Health, and then we have delegated oversight of the program, and it supports our work to improve drinking water quality. And the governor's budget increase would have helped to fund the training and staff for that program. Both the House and Senate took out that fee increase. We would like to see it in there because it does support work done here at the city of Minneapolis. And then in the House bill, there is funding included for pre-weatherization work and weatherization assistance program. So those are a couple of the highlights from the energy and environment area. Moving on to health, the Senate and House both restored funding for cannabis-related prevention and education programs and those would be grants for local public health departments. And then both bills also include funding for food shelf programs, the Senate at a higher level than the House. And then moving on to transportation, both the House and the Senate include money for traffic calming. In the Senate bill, it's $1 million for cities of the first class, which of course includes Minneapolis, and it creates an account, so that is potentially could be an account that's then funded in the future as well. The Senate bill does remove funding for the Northern Lights Express Rail project. And then it maintains funding levels for the Transportation Advancement Account, which is an account we use to fund projects in Minneapolis. The House Omnibus Bill also includes traffic calming money, so it's really great that we have it in both places. The House includes it as a $5 million direct appropriation to Minneapolis. We think it's unlikely that will stick at that level in conference committee, but it is good that it's in both bills. The House Transportation Bill also delays implementation of climate mitigation-related road projects. That was a point of contention in the floor debate yesterday, and did lead to a number of DFL members opposing the bill. The bill did pass off the House floor yesterday, so that will be also sorted out in conference. And then in the House bill, they include a provision that would require doing an analysis of the Blue Line extension as BRT rather than LRT. Councilmember Ellison did come over earlier in session to testify against a bill that would have prevented prevented spending on future LRT projects. So this is sort of an alternative to that, which obviously we were concerned about preventing spending on future LRT projects. This would be a study at looking at it as a BRT project. And then on public safety and judiciary, the bills do include funding on a number of programs that are important to the city, including programs through the Office of Justice programs, the Crime Victim Services, and then the Philando Castile training account. So those are things we're monitoring. As you can see here, the amounts are similar for the first two items, but the House has quite a bit more for training in its omnibus bill. So that'll be sorted out in conference as well. And then just to wrap up, I wanted to highlight a couple of policy items that are either moving or under discussion, and then we can pause for additional questions if there are any. So there has been a fair amount of discussion on paid family medical leave and potential modifications to the bill that was adopted. Some of the ideas that have been discussed are delaying implementation for another year, or some additional exemptions for smaller businesses. We anticipate this will be sorted out as end of session negotiations among leadership. And so we'll see where that goes. The Senate liquor bill passed off the Senate floor yesterday. It did include a provision that would allow social districts in any city statewide if a city chose to do so. And so that it would be up to the local government to pass an ordinance meeting the state statute, but it would give local governments that authority to do that. That is not included in the House bill, so that will have to be sorted out in conference. The zoning reform I already mentioned as a policy item. I think we've already covered that, but that's another sort of outstanding policy piece that's still under discussion. And then lastly, another policy item that is still being discussed in the transportation area is around municipal state aid design standards. So there is a working group working on potential modifications to the state design standards, especially related to safety. And these are for MSA roads, so roads that we put into our MSA system. Mr. Huser has been working on this closely, so if there are more questions on the details of that, he can answer those. But those are just some of the sort of remaining policy items under discussion, but the bulk of the work for the next few weeks will, of course, be on the budget. So with that, that's all we had prepared to present to you, but happy to take additional questions if there are any.
Yes, thank you, Director Topinka. We have a few people on queue here. I'll recognize Councilmember Wansley.
Thank you, Chair Chowdhury. Director Topinka, could you just spell out a little bit of what's included in this $103 million for the Office of Justice Programming funding under public safety?
Chair, Councilmember, for the record, Steve Huser with IGR. Off the top of my head, without having it in front of me, Councilmember, that funding generally funds a wide array of different grant programs. They can include things like recruitment, retention, things that are related to like community safety type work. So those are competitive grant program money that we would have to apply for, but it kind of runs the public safety gamut. So if there's something you have in mind, my guess is there's something that would apply within that array of grant programs.
Okay, and this is about the standard amount that they usually get, or I'm just trying to get a sense of if there were any specific projects, because I know at the beginning of the legislative session, Governor Walz had some specific public safety projects that he wanted to be advanced through the session, so I wasn't sure if this was representative of that.
Chair and Councilmember, I would, without having the spreadsheet right in front of me, I'd have to take a look and see how that amount compared to the base.
Okay.
Whether it was a reduction from base. I just don't want to say the wrong thing on the record right now because I just don't remember it off the top of my head.
Okay, yeah, that would be great, because, I mean, I'm looking at the 103 million, and of course, that's a significant investment, and wanting to know the breakdown, especially in light of the conversation that we're having around, for instance, housing and homelessness, where there seems to be difficulty in identifying $13 million to essentially help us make sure we're maintaining basic homelessness services and providers. So just wanting to understand the prioritization of specific programs within their public safety department, like how are these programs either supporting preventative efforts or and just looking holistically at some of these other priorities where we're seeing workforce, labor, economic development, there's targets of reduction. And I think of these are typically, as you mentioned, grants that support programs that actually meet the needs of everyday people from a human service side. So wanted to get a better sense of what is actually going into that 103 million, where there seems to be some alignment between both the Senate and the House side.
Councilmember Wansley, do you want an administrative follow-up?
That would be great.
Okay, so I'll just note for the clerks to work with IGR to get an administrative follow-up on the 103 million for the Office of Justice Program funding.
Awesome. And then another question that I did have is regarding, there was also conversations around, in the Senate side, and this is on a kind of policy aspect around I-94 and really looking at how we can strengthen the PAC, or Policy Advisory Committee. Do you know where those conversations stand? I know there was some legislation advanced to support those efforts.
Chair and Councilmember, my best recollection on that conversation was that provision is, to the best of my knowledge, not included in either transportation omnibus bill.
Okay.
And so those hearings were for the standalone bills. That doesn't mean that it would be unlikely that those would move independently at this point in session. Mm-hmm. And unless something were to happen within my best assumption is, unless something happens within the negotiation in the conference committee to bring the two transportation bills together, mm-hmm. that would be the next best opportunity for something like that to be brought forward. But for this session, I don't know that it will probably progress. But okay. I can also look into a little bit further if that's get a little bit more detail for you on that one as well.
Yeah, that would be good. I'll note that for our administrative follow-up on that one. I forget the specific name of that provision. And then the last question that I had was, I know a lot of the sports owners or stadium owners also went to the Capitol this session, also looking to receive public subsidies for renovations. Wanted to get a sense of kind of where those things landed or conversations landed as well. If we should be expecting the state legislator to be also providing funding to those folks or asset holders.
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Wansley, I can take that question. So the City of St. Paul did come forward with a request for, I believe it's about $300 million in appropriation bonds for Xcel Energy Center and then also a revamp of the River Center. They have had a couple of informational hearings on their bill, and at this point, I think it's unclear what the next steps are. If it is going to be funded, it will likely be either in the capital investment or tax bill in some way. I know that they are still working on it, the team and the city, but I don't know for sure if it will be included this year. I think it's received sort of mixed feedback. And then in addition to that, the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority, which owns US Bank Stadium, has a proposal for appropriation bonds to finish the secure perimeter that they got some initial funding for last year. Again, that's an appropriation bond request, and they've had an informational hearing, and we likely won't know for sure if it will be included until the capital investment bill comes out. And then I think those are the two primary asks this year that have come forward. Am I missing any? I don't think so. So again, I think to be determined, but there's definitely, an array of opinions on whether or how the state should be investing in sports stadiums. And that has been brought up in conversation.
And then for the U.S. Bank Stadium's proposal specifically for the secure, you said perimeter, is that mostly fencing? Do you know, is that for the fencing?
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Wansley, yes, it's fencing that they are seeking to comply with some federal, I believe it's Homeland Security standards for major events. That's why they're requesting that money.
Huh. Is there a way to get an administrative follow-up on if you just have what that Department of Homeland Security fencing provision entails? That would be great. And then also just a quick follow-up in the theme of sports and athleticism, sports betting. Where did that also land, just knowing that would have a direct impact in my ward, and just concerns of how that will relate to the athletic scene there, and lots of thoughts. But yes,
Sure.
I know that was moving its way through the legislature last year, and not sure where it ended here.
Chair Chowdhury and Councilmember Wansley, it did not move forward this session. So there was at least one hearing, but it did not make it out of committee in the Senate. And I don't think there were hearings in the House, but I'll let Mr. Huser add more to this.
Chair Chowdhury and Councilmember Wansley. There was also, in addition to the committee action this session related to that bill, there was, if I'm recalling correctly, an attempt to re-refer that bill out of the Commerce Committee that it's, I believe, currently in, or out of, I want to get this right. It's not in Commerce Committee, but there was a floor motion to try to refer that bill back to the Commerce Committee to try and maybe do further work on it. That vote did not prevail. So the bill had a negative vote in committee, so it continues to stay in that committee unless there's another vote retaken to move it. An attempt to then move it out through floor action of the Senate also failed. So it would be, this time of year, I would say things are never quite zero, but it would be very unlikely, I think, for something to happen this session unless somebody either changes their mind or something else changes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Huser.
Thank
the questions
you.
I have.
Yeah, I will note that there was that administrative follow-up on the fencing for U.S. Bank Stadium, and I think there was another provision that we didn't get clarity on the name of, so I'll just request that Mr. Huser and Councilmember Wansley, after committee, make sure that our clerks just know what you're speaking to. Okay, I will go to Councilmember Jenkins, and then I'll come back to myself.
Thank you, Chair Chowdhury, and thank you, Director Topinka, for these updates. I'm curious, and you talked a little bit about some of the housing legislation that's going forward, but yeah, I think you mentioned the parking situation, but there's a number of other bills that are being supported by Coalition Yes to Homes, and are you familiar with the status of those bills and how they're proceeding through the House, Senate?
Yes, Chair Chowdhury and Councilmember Jenkins. So as you mentioned, there is a coalition that has been supporting a package of bills around zoning reform and housing density. And so there were primarily 3 bills, or maybe a few more than that, but a few different bills that were moving.
Yeah, I think there's like 5.
Yeah. So one was a parking minimum, getting rid of parking minimums. There was one around aesthetic mandates. There was a couple around allowing duplexes, triplexes statewide. And then there was some around missing middle and requiring specific zoning standards so that cities we're allowing for more missing middle housing development. For the most part, those bills did not move forward out of committee. In the House, they were heard in the Housing Committee and then moved to the Local Government Committee, where they didn't end up having a hearing. In the Senate, they similarly were heard in Housing and then moved to the State and Local Government Committee and ended up not being heard there either. However, on the House side, they did include a provision in their budget bill, and that this is what I had referred to earlier, that requires Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to include points for projects. So this is housing developments that are applying for funding from the state. They will get more points if they're located in cities that have some specific policies around being sort of pro-density. And the language in that proposal it is largely things we already do. And so we feel comfortable that projects in Minneapolis would compete well for those points. On the Senate side, they just yesterday scheduled another hearing in the State and Local Government Committee that will be happening this Thursday, where they're hearing some of the provisions that were in some of those different bills. So that's kind of, I think, the likely probably the last hearing on that this session, and so we'll see if that prevails in committee and then moves on to the floor. But some of the provisions that they're still considering are, it's not entirely getting rid of parking minimums, but it's saying cities can only require, I believe, one, I'd have to double check the language, but one parking space per unit. It has some requirements around aesthetic mandates, so saying cities can't require things like balconies or other things that might be required on multifamily housing. And then it has some administrative review, so things saying requiring that certain parts of a process can be done through an administrative process rather than public hearings are some of the provisions. And so that has a hearing this Thursday. So we'll see if that moves forward.
Yeah, thank you. The initial comments you made about points for cities that are already in density, sort of, the goal, I think, of this coalition is to expand housing throughout the state, and if communities that already have density get more points, that's not really helping that issue per se. But thank you, and for my colleagues, this coalition, Yes to Homes, and hopefully many of you have spoken with them, but they are really trying to increase housing development across the state in order to bring down costs, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully some of these bills will get further hearings. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Topinka, I just had some questions around transportation. It's really great to see the traffic calming funding move through. I really disheartened to hear about the removal of the $194 million for the Northern Lights Express. Could you, Mr. Huser, kind of share what does that mean? Should that funding be removed?
So, Madam Chair, the $194 million for Northern Lights is being recommended in the Senate bill, so the House does not speak to that provision. So that money, based on my recollection of the discussion of that provision in the Senate side, there is some ideas about other money that could potentially be used through the state rail office to potentially continue the work that could potentially be done with the federal government. There is a question about what federal funds would potentially be available going forward for the project. Also, so there's also that dynamic coming into play of how much it's a question to the legislators of how much state resources should go towards federal money that potentially wouldn't be there. And so that was the kind of the color of the debate related to that provision. I could not tell you for sure what will come out of conference committee related to that. It was an area of the budget that the Transportation Committee and the Senate had access to because I believe they had a zero target for their committee. So it would be really, if I'm anticipating a question, it'd be hard for me to guess what the chances are of that provision, whether they would, some of their options could be to leave it alone, zero it out, or do some sort of a cut, but leave some money available to the state to work with other partners on that project.
Just following up on that, this funding is separate from the match that was, the match that was appropriated last May? Or is it the same amount? I know in 2023, I think it was like around the same figure, 194.
Madam Chair, I believe it's the same amount. So it's the money, the 194 million that was passed in the 2023 budget for 24-25.
So my understanding is if we don't have a local match at that level, we won't, there's not a chance for us to get federal grants, even if the federal government currently is not friendly to Minnesota or states like ours. What does that mean? Should this, even before conference, not pass? Like, does that mean design work just stops? Does that mean the project just stalls out? Are we not going to see that connection between Minnesota and Duluth?
Madam Chair, I don't want to say that it would kill it outright, because I believe there was a part of the discussion where there was potentially other options for the state to continue work. Obviously not at the same kind of a level that the 194 million appropriation could potentially allow for. But I can get back to the committee on more of the specifics of like, if this, then that kind of scenarios of if this is zeroed out, what does that mean, or what other options are available to the state to continue work on that project?
Yeah, that would be good for administrative follow-up, because I know that we have a seat on the city council on a board around the Northern Lights Express and are part of the discussion. I think Vice Chair Rainville, you're the member on that. The other questions that I had on the transportation part is this study for BRT, Blue Line Extension instead of LRT. Is there a dollar amount attached to that?
Madam Chair, I do not believe so. I believe it's a directive of the Met Council to do that study. I would have to double check and get back to you on whether or not they actually allocated specific money to do that work, or if they're expecting Met Council to take on that cost.
Okay, and is that thought behind it to kind of put a pause in the work that's happening, or the work will continue and the study will happen concurrently?
Madam Chair, my understanding is that the work would continue, so nothing would actually be delayed by doing this. It would just be a directive to the Met Council to study the viability and the options of BRT as an alternative to LRT.
Okay. And my last question is, I've heard some of the rumblings around the delay of implementation of climate mitigation related to road projects. Could you kind of, for the public and the rest of the body, detail out what climate mitigation in this scenario means?
Madam Chair, so in the 2023 legislative session, the transportation bill included a process where whenever a road project is, I believe the basic criteria is if it's looking to expand either lanes or something that is, substantively different to the volume of traffic on or is proposing to expand the traffic on a roadway, that these studies would have to be looked at to discover ways to mitigate the increased carbon and greenhouse gas emissions from that the project would potentially produce. So it would not necessarily be saying that the project could not go forward. It would just ask that the project then the project leaders identify then how to offset the increases to greenhouse gases. What is being proposed in the House Transportation Omnibus Bill is to delay, and there is a little bit of there was some disagreement about this on the House floor debate yesterday on the transportation bill, but my understanding of it is that it would be an approximately 3-year delay. Legally, that policy is in effect now. It is law. It went into effect in February of this year. So it would be, there was some discussion about whether to call it a delay or just a halt, because it is technically the law now. And so I think, Madam Chair, that kind of answers that question or your question. So yes, it is, that is what the law is doing. And then this would be a pause of implementation for approximately 3 years and then the advocates have said that this pause would allow for some of the discussion about how do you find the offsets, whether or not there's correct metrics to calculate what the impacts of a project would have, that sort of thing.
And the Senate hasn't entered into the conversation around this provision quite yet, because I imagine that there's pretty steep opposition.
Madam Chair, my assumption, this has not been discussed in the Senate side. It's not included in the Senate omnibus bill. I would be surprised if this was something that the Senate agreed to. However, given the current situation and finding some sort of an agreement on some of these bills, I wouldn't say that a version of this couldn't get done. Obviously, there's a lot of options. These are two approaches that are being brought together, so it's a hard one to anticipate.
Okay, thank you. My comment on that, just to pass along, is I think the climate mitigation legislation that passed is really critical for the ways in which Minnesota can scale addressing climate change at a state level. Without that data and information to offset like the number one way that we make emissions as a state, even for 3 years, especially as we're seeing the temperature rise every single year. I think we hit 1.5 Celsius this past year, is really, really unsettling. And I don't think in line with the goals of the city of Minneapolis. So appreciate just you going through the details of that. And then I will go to Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions. The first is for you, Mr. Huser, because it's about MSA routes. There's more and more interest, well, I don't know, there's more and more vocal interest in traffic calming on our city's MSA routes. In fact, we're working on one this year as part of the traffic calming program. I don't know where in the city, I just remember hearing that. Based on the committee's work, do you foresee new design standards that might allow for these kinds of features in the future? Well, I don't think we're working to fully redesign too many MSA routes in our city right now. I know that generally speaking, the reason why they're MSA routes is that it's meant to move trucks, traffic, emergency vehicles faster. In our Transportation Action Plan, one of our initiatives we have in it is to evaluate potential changes the city may request to municipal state aid routes to better align with our updated street typologies. So because I know you're following this committee's work, is this going in our direction with state legislators interested in this type of thing, or is it going in the opposite direction?
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Palmisano, I would say, in general, it's likely going in our direction. I think that I'm cautiously optimistic that an agreement can be struck to find the right balance between the purpose of the MSA system with the safety needs that we've identified for, non-vehicle, movement in and around those intersections especially. And so the city is, myself and some staff from Public Works are participating in some stakeholder work that's happening to try to come up with some solutions that would allow cities the opportunity to have some of the options that we are looking at that are going to be considered are, what does what changes to the variance process could look like? Are there things that are in current rule that could potentially be changed in state law to allow for things like lane width? What are the different kinds of design elements or other design, standards that could be applied to MSA projects that would allow for some of these safety considerations to be considered and design elements to be considered that aren't currently part of the design manual? I think one thing we're also looking at though is that these design standards are created by state, local engineers, and so these are professionals in their profession that were creating these designs, and so we're just kind of then looking at how do you potentially maintain that whole process while also then balancing that out with the needs and concerns of communities. And so that is the work that myself and like I said, a couple others from Public Works are going to be participating in. And then hopefully if we can come up with a recommendation between us and other stakeholders that have an interest in those projects, I do think that we can. I'm cautiously optimistic that something can be put forward to the conference committee and would come out of that that's beneficial to everybody.
Thank you. That's helpful. The other just clarification I wanted to make is something that I think Director Topinka had in her slides, which is the $5.7 million for the water yard, the funds that need to be given to East Phillips neighborhood, Epney, for the roof depot site?
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Palmisano, yes, the water yard is related to the roof depot project. The way it would likely happen is that the funding would come to the city for the future water yard, but it would be part of the agreement that was made with the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute and allow for that sale to move forward.
And we had allowed it one extra year, most recently?
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Palmisano, yes, that's correct. I believe the current purchase agreement expires sometime this summer. I don't recall the exact date.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll recognize Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Chowdhury, and I apologize, Director Topinka, I didn't ask these questions when you were, in my first questioning, but I'm just curious, are there any anti-LGBT or trans youth legislation moving forward in the legislature, and if so, what's the status of those bills?
Chair Chowdhury, Councilmember Jenkins, to the best of my knowledge, no, there is nothing moving forward. Earlier this session, there were a couple of hearings in the House, either prior to when the power sharing agreement went into place or at a time when one of the GOP chairs was hosting committee. They did have a couple of discussions around trans youth in sports, but they had hearings and they did have one floor debate prior to the power sharing agreement being in place in the House, but nothing passed. And since there's been the power sharing agreement in place, there have not been further floor discussions. And given the makeup of the legislature at this point, don't anticipate anything moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask one last time before we move to the federal portion if any of my colleagues have any question on the state part of the presentation. I'm not seeing any, so Director Topinka, Lauren Olson, we can move ahead to the federal part.
Good morning, Madam Chair, council members. I'm Lauren Olson, Senior Government Relations Representative, and I'm here to speak a little bit about what's going on at a federal level. As you can imagine, I can't provide you with anything near a comprehensive overview, and you're following a lot of things in the news. So we'll just hit on some highlights and talk about some issues that have potential impact to the enterprise and our ability to serve residents. The first thing I want to talk about is the budget talks that are coming up right now. So Congress just returned from their recess, and so I think you're really going to start to see the discussion become more robust about the proposed budget. And specifically, as you know, Congress expects to use probably the reconciliation process, and that will allow a slim Republican majority to pass something without Democratic support. But in order to use reconciliation process, you need the Senate and the House to agree on the exact terms. And it's been harder for them, it's been difficult for them because to reach some of these targets, you really do have to touch some programs that a lot of Americans do value and have been pushing back on. So currently, the House is working on a process where they're looking for $1.5 trillion to cut, and the Senate is looking to cut is targeting at least $4 billion in cuts at the moment. And so the committees that have jurisdiction over certain subject matter are working, and we're starting to see each committee come forward with, if they have jurisdiction over, let's say, Department of Homeland Security, they will have recommendations about where to trim there, for example. And I think, we're all carefully watching for things coming out of Energy and Commerce, which would affect Medicaid and a lot of other programs that I think we care about and our residents care about. As discussed before, the goal of the House is to cut $880 billion over 10 years from the bucket that includes Medicaid. But Medicaid makes up such a big portion of that bucket too that, again, it's like how you're going to have to cut there if you want to reach that target. So again, it's not entirely popular with a lot of the public, so they're having a hard time figuring out in reality how to have those cuts. And they need those cuts, as you know, in order to continue to extend tax cuts that tend to benefit the wealthiest Americans. In order to extend that, they need to, that's why they're making these cuts. They also are going to increase the debt ceiling. An interesting thing to keep an eye on is that on the Senate side, some in the Senate are treating those tax cuts as if they're in place and therefore they don't need to account for them going forward, and they can pretend that it's not a cost going forward. Whereas the House side clearly has said, this is going to cost us $4.5 trillion over 10 years if we want to continue these. And they're trying to account for that with the cuts or with by increasing the debt ceiling. But some folks on the Senate side are trying to say that, we have this in place already. We don't really need to account for the fact that this costs us money in the long run. So be interesting discussions going forward on that. We are in regular communication with our delegation about our priorities on this, including, the council president and other council members. We're in DC to have some of these conversations face to face where we're really talking about budget priorities. Health commissioner was out in DC also having those conversations, but we work with them regularly. And Representative Omar was recently visited one of our school-based clinics and really got to hear more about the important services that we can provide through funding and the importance of Medicaid and the payments that Medicaid provides to sustain a lot of resources that people across the state rely on, including rural hospitals. But yeah, we're in great communication with our delegation about this issue. We don't cover all the executive orders here, but I thought we should maybe touch on a couple that came in the last night or end of business yesterday. Thought it might be of interest. One of those orders was about unleashing law enforcement and includes a number of provisions. Some of interest include that it requires within 60 days for the Attorney General to review all ongoing federal consent decrees and essentially look at whether or not they should continue. And then there's also a plan to create a mechanism that would support the legal defense of law enforcement officers accused of wrongdoing. There's also a reference there to the potential for pro bono representation, and I'm wondering if they're going to try to utilize some of those law firms for that purpose, but they want to create a mechanism to provide support. There was also discussion in there about making, military equipment more accessible to law enforcement, which is something that we've kind of seen sometimes in the past also. And then there's this language here about the Attorney General prioritizing prosecution of any applicable violations of federal criminal law with respect to state and local jurisdictions whose officials, and I'm just kind of reading directly from it since we got it last night, but whose officials prohibit law enforcement officers from carrying out duties necessary for public safety and law enforcement, and whose officials unlawfully engage in discrimination based on diversity, equity, inclusion. I think you're all well aware, too, that the word discrimination gets used in a manner by the administration that's very different from how we have thought of discrimination in the past. On that note, too, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Office has seen a huge loss in staffing. They're usually handling discrimination claims that we, that are more familiar to us. But they went from 380 to, I think, 140. I think I wrote that down somewhere. 380 to about 140 staff. So as the administration really transforms all the things that they want that division to be focused on. But I don't know exactly how you have a criminal prosecution against a jurisdiction, but I'll let the lawyers sort that one out, and we'll keep an eye on this. Another executive order yesterday requires that within 30 days, the Attorney General, working with Department of Homeland Security, publish a list of sanctuary jurisdictions that they then intend to notify those jurisdictions of how they think that they're violating various federal laws. They intend to identify funds for suspension or termination, and then if jurisdictions are defiant in their view, they will use legal and enforcement action. So they have a number of steps. This is kind of par for the course, and in terms of, we're seeing similar things to this of just trying to go after people who they see as inconsistent with their administration policies, whatever they may be. This executive order also includes this language about, discussing that they believe state and local officials use their authority to violate, obstruct, and defy the enforcement of immigration laws. They list some ways that they feel that laws they think are violated. They call this a lawless insurrection and discrimination against Americans in favor of aliens, in their terms, illegal aliens. So this is another term, discriminate. Now it's discrimination against Americans. Terminology like lawless or like insurrection definitely is concerning in terms of what tools I think they want to, how they're viewing this and the tools they would want to use. Pivoting a little bit just to the general topic of kind of some of the threats to some of the funding that we rely on in general. And this is, probably a sample of issues. As you know, we've kind of, jurisdictions have been inundated with different attempts to claw back money or threaten money. But a recent example, so this, I think it was April 24th, a letter came out from the Secretary of Transportation about kind of, in their words, clarifying what the legal obligations come along with receiving federal funds. Of course, I think there could be some disagreement about whether those things listed are obligations, but they kind of purport to say these are the terms, or this is what you agreed to when you agreed to take funds, and if you are not complying with all of our kind of, if you're discriminating against people, and again, their view of discrimination, would be, I think you guys get it, but involves, are you discriminating against women based on sex, but that's really about, by supporting transgender people, or their view of discrimination is different. So the letter threatens, if you're discriminating and you're also not in compliance with what they see as the federal status of federal law, they would look to maybe terminate funds, and they also would hope to recover funds that were already expended, which is something new there. Again, just like with the executive orders and with this, I think we always have to have the caveat that obviously it doesn't make it legal when you write it down this way. So this was sent to all the recipients of federal funds, letting people know their view of the obligations and what they would like to do if people are not consistent with their goals. So that's something we're just contending with that's fairly new. Another thing that happened that had a more positive resolution, so this is something positive here, the FEMA informed recipients that certain grants that went to certain jurisdictions that either had certain immigration policies or were identified as sanctuary cities would undergo greater scrutiny for potential review, new conditions, potential termination. This was a FEMA Homeland Security collaboration. But due to various court decisions, they realized they could not proceed with attempting to apply these new conditions to these existing grant programs. They could not stop those programs based on this. So, somewhat helpful. But I think a big issue going forward, so in many of the attempts at, kind of clawing back funds have met some serious obstacles. But a very big issue to contend with going forward is that now, as we have new grant agreements that don't have executed agreements, we're getting contracts with different terms in them, that some which may not be acceptable to us as a city. And of course, though, I'm sure there'll be legal pushback too in terms of the new terms coming from the agencies. We know that the Department of Transportation, for example, is still working on their new template for their grant agreements, and I'm sure there'll be some concerns there. More example of like some positive things. So as you know, the city was a party to San Francisco v. Trump, where the administration just kind of ordered agencies to withhold funds from sanctuary jurisdictions, what they define as a sanctuary jurisdiction. And the court granted a preliminary injunction which prohibits the administration from withholding funds on that basis. So obviously that was a very good thing. I would expect that there would be an appeal, but if you can ask Harold questions about that from the city attorney's office if you have any. Also, regarding those COVID-19 funds, there was an attempt to claw back money provided from COVID-19. Minnesota, under the leadership of Attorney General Ellison, joined lawsuit with other states over that. It was $11 billion in national investment, and got a temporary restraining order to restore those funds. Those flow through the state, and as far as I know, we might be still working out the communication with if we can start to utilize those funds again. In order to track, these impacts, we've just enhanced some of our city processes and protocols. As you know, the city council adopted a resolution about how to accept a grant, go through formal steps. We have some internal tracking tools so that we make sure when there are changes or threats to the funds that it gets into a system that people can see that information. We also have protocols and standards to make sure that when we are getting new contract terms or revised contract terms, that we're looking at those to make sure they're consistent with city policies and practices. And there's some internal working groups that really that include a lot of finance folks that also help to make sure that we are tracking the funding threats, as well as a group that looks at it from a policy perspective. Well, those are some of the things I wanted to maybe highlight for today. Sorry. But are there any questions for me that do my best?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah, the federal presentation, I don't think is one that we ever look forward to anymore in this committee, but I appreciate all of your work, Lauren, in putting it together and tracking it for us. I know that in it of itself is like a challenge to do, but really, really important. And I just have one quick question, and this is maybe for our City Attorney Harold Melcher. Just kind of wanted to see if you could speak to where we are with that preliminary injunction and kind of what next steps are and what we're waiting for. I know that if there's appeal, the injunction could be removed, but if you could just clarify for us.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So where we are in that is that we had oral argument last week. The judge in that oral argument was inclined to grant the preliminary injunction, and then the following day he did just that. And so what it effectively does, and Lauren described this very well, is that it prevents the Trump administration from withholding federal funding based off of their designation of cities or jurisdictions as sanctuary jurisdictions. And so moving forward, we generally expect an appeal of that. It hasn't come through as of checking. I checked this just yesterday afternoon. I hadn't seen it. I can check in with our litigators again after this meeting to see if anything has come through. We generally expect one, though. There was, in the previous Trump administration, there was a lawsuit very similar to the one that San Francisco brought and that we are a party to. It was, to my recollection, appealed as well within the Ninth Circuit. So, and it was upheld, that the appeal was upheld. So we can likely expect the same thing. Until then, there's not really a whole lot more to report.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, the actions of the Trump administration that are coming down and that we're getting in these reports are truly reprehensible, and I know that our communities are feeling a lot of anxiety, and I think they're feeling some safety in being in the state of Minnesota, but that's something I can clearly communicate out to our IGR team and anyone that's listening, as people are anxious, especially with the impending cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. One thing that I've been hearing from community members asking us, and perhaps you might have some information or updates, is around the revocations of visas for individuals who might be using their First Amendment rights to take a political position. Also, we've been seeing people going to get their citizenship and being stopped right before that. We've had an instance in the University of Minnesota campus, and then also in Mankato, and then also experiences by trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming community members struggling just to get identification, documentation. And I don't know if you have any updates or if our Attorney General is working on anything in regards to these instances.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now I'm trying to remember if the Attorney General is or is not, but his office has certainly been prolific and is doing an amazing job on touching so many issues. It's a complicated question, so what I would say, though, I would just remind concerned residents that we try to make sure that a lot of helpful resources are accessible to them, and one way to do that is to go to the website for the Office of Immigrant Refugee Affairs, and they will find a lot of resources and information there about their rights. And we will also be, we're also looking to enhance information available to transgender individuals and to address some of the concerns coming up right now as well. So the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department is looking to really make sure that there's good resources there. I'm trying to remember I can't remember offhand, I'm sorry, if the Attorney General, as you know, the state of Minnesota has joined the birthright citizenship, law challenge and such. But I cannot remember if there's anything else recently. So
yeah, we can leave that up to administrative follow-up and just
Okay.
getting at any of the information that our Attorney General's office or any other states or cities are doing in response to these egregious actions that are violating people's civil liberties and basic rights would be really, really good to know. But have really appreciated the way that the city of Minneapolis altogether have stepped up to join on to these lawsuits and just take this proactive and reactive action. And that's been something that I've been consistently sharing out with community members as they've been asking, even in my own office hours or in community. I'm sure other council members have experienced questions about the federal level as local leaders. And I'll just say, just a comment to you all, and if there's something that could be done with the city council or in our next update in this committee, if there's ways in which we can continue to send up some of what we're advocating for or what we're hearing from residents to our federal delegation. I thought that conversation that we got to have with Senator Smith, Senator Klobuchar, and Congresswoman Omar was really, really impactful for them, even as they shared in our conversations. And so want to continue up that dialogue, even as we're not going to be going to Washington,
Yes.
D.C.
Oh,
for another
absolutely,
year.
yes.
So if we can kind of brainstorm on ways to do that together, that would be great. Colleagues, are there any questions or comments for the federal portion of this presentation? Okay, I am not seeing any of that in queue or from my colleagues up here, so seeing no further discussion, I'll ask the clerks to receive and file that presentation. And with that, we've concluded all business to come before the committee today, and without objection, we are adjourned.